Chapter 5 The Colonial Order. The genesis of the current cultural dilemma in Mexico is, then, to be found in the installation of a colonial order beginning in the third decade of the 16th century. It was then that a split society was created. Its dividing line marks the subordination of a group of peoples of Mesoamerican culture to an invading group whose culture was different and of Western origin. A colonial situation took form in which the colonizing society affirmed its superiority ideologically in every area in which it might be compared to those colonized. This situation conditioned many fundamental characteristics of the independent Mexico until the present. Thus, it is well to review in summary form the principal aspects of the system of cultural control implanted almost 500 years ago. A new method of domination. The domination of one group by another is a phenomenon that was not absent in pre-colonial Mexico. Subjugation by military force occurred in many regions and in different periods. However, it did not always occur, nor was it present in all areas. According to the available evidence, in the central Maya area during the period of classic splendor, for example, ending at the end of the 9th century and beginning of the 10th, one cannot speak of imperial domination. Archaeologist Alberto Ruiz points out the diversity of local styles found in that area, a diversity that was the result of particular developments in Maya culture produced within independent states. According to Ruiz, the later rise of Chichen was not based on military domination, but rather on commerce, which took place even over long distances. And in the Central Valleys, militarism became an important aspect of social organization only after the fall of Teotihuacan at the end of the 7th or the beginning of the 8th century. Nevertheless, at the time of the European invasion, there unquestionably existed a powerful structure of domination which subjugated many scattered peoples in the central and southern part of the country to the Triple Alliance, under the hegemony of the Mexica. Under the government of Itzcoatl, Aztec militarism was reinforced and consolidated in Tenochtitlan at the beginning of the 4th decade of the 15th century. Tlacaelel occupied the position of Cihuacoatl, sharing power with the Huaytlatoani during the reigns of 3 successive Mexica rulers. He seems to have played a major role as the real power behind the throne, pushing for reforms that favored the military aristocracy. Tlacaelel represented a different line from that of Netzahualcoyotl, Lord of Texcoco. After the defeat of this city, the new allies, Texcoco and Tenochtitlan, conquered Azcapotzalco. It was then that the changes began that modified Mexica society by putting the representatives of military power in a dominant position. Friedrich Katz points out, for instance, that the warriors received lands from the defeated Azcapotzalco, while the Macehuales, the ordinary people, did not. Democracy in Mexica society was lost. The representatives of the Capuli, or the residential clan groups, had formerly elected the Huaytlatoani, but the new electors now became the members of the military aristocracy. To justify all this, history was rewritten. The old pictographic books were burned and others were painted, describing the Aztecs as the chosen ones, the people of the sun. This all seems to have created a new situation in Mesoamerica, the possible outcome of which must remain speculative, since the process was abruptly interrupted with the fall of Tenochtitlan at the hands of the Spaniards. Mexica rule may have been unique, making it difficult to generalize about the forms of domination in pre-colonial Mexico. Nevertheless, it is the best documented case, and it may allow us to explore some traits that help explain the meaning and characteristics of domination in the pre-colonial world. It is clear that a primary objective was to obtain tribute. The people subjected to Mexica rule periodically delivered tribute, which was concentrated in the cities of the Triple Alliance. Part of the tribute might also benefit other cities in the lake region of the Valley of Mexico. These cities had the double position of subjects and circumstantial allies. It is well to highlight one aspect of the tributary system. The goods and products required from each subject people formed part of what was produced locally, before Aztec rule was imposed. The defeated cities were obligated to produce more or to consume less in order to pay the tribute assigned to them. This extraction of wealth inevitably impoverished the peoples subject to tribute. Nevertheless, it did not imply a fundamental alteration in their productive systems. They kept on producing the same thing and in the same manner, except that now they were obligated to surrender part of the product. There may have been exceptions, in which some subject towns were forced to produce something they had not produced before, but this was not the norm. One reason was that the diversity of ecological niches occupied by the subject peoples allow a diversity of tributary products. This fact, in turn, permitted the dominant cities to control a variety of goods from distinct sources, goods not found in their own region. The fact that goods produced by distinct peoples had significance and were desired by others who occupied different ecological niches reveals something more important. One and all belonged to the same civilization, which made the diverse local products compatible. It was not necessary to modify what we would call the production schemes of the subject peoples in order to make their products acceptable to a dominant society with different consumption needs. This suggests that when people share the same civilization, as in Mesoamerica, political domination does not lead to abandonment or substitution of the predominant production practices. Rather, it may lead to the impoverishment of the subject population or to increased production on their part to compensate for the tribute extracted. No situation of initial incompatibility exists between what is produced, which is part of the culture itself, and what is paid as tribute. To reinforce this point, it is well to remember that one of the general obligations the Aztecs imposed on all regions under their domination was the organization of regular markets in which local products could be traded. In distant provinces, such as along the border with the Maya, subject peoples did not have to pay tribute. Their obligation was to provide men for the garrisons, to feed the troops, and to facilitate opportunities for commerce. Merchants had great importance in Aztec society. Besides their main activity, they also carried out a form of espionage, transmitting information of a military and also, no doubt, commercial nature. I am not familiar with any study that has compared the products entering Tenochtitlan in the form of tribute with those from commerce. Nevertheless, merchants were socially important, and the routes they covered extended far beyond the frontiers of Aztec domination. These facts allow us to assume that in economic terms, commercial activities were at least as important as tribute. It seems reasonable to suggest that many wars of conquest sought openings for commerce, as much or as more than they did the imposition of tribute. In any case, the undeniable importance of commerce also demonstrates the point I made above. Peoples who belong to the same stratum of civilization are compatible in terms of production. In areas under Mexica control, the military presence also had characteristics that help explain the nature of pre-colonial domination. In some sites, there were permanent garrisons, but in many there were not. It was necessary only to send the calpisque, an official in charge of collecting tribute. Some peoples participated in the military campaigns of the Triple Alliance by providing men for war, in return for which they received part of the booty. Mechanisms for indirect political control also existed. That is, local officials and the internal structure of authority were maintained, with certain restrictions imposed. Katz summarizes these restrictions as follows. New leaders had to be approved by the Mexica state. Declarations of war or peace treaties were also the prerogative of the Aztecs. And in cities along the lakes, the Mexica made all decisions about irrigation works. A frequent way of consolidating Aztec domination was marriage alliance between members of the respecting governing elites. Thus were established new loyalties based on a relationship different from military power. It should also be pointed out that the Aztecs didn't establish permanent colonies in the areas they dominated. The only exceptions, according to Katz, were along the Tarascan and Maya borders. For a complete understanding, the religious implications of domination should also be mentioned, since in the Mesoamerican world that dimension had an intense presence in all aspects of life. There was no religious aspect to the wars of domination in the sense that there was no effort to impose the victors' religion on those conquered. Even Aztec religion, following the reforms of Tlacaello, was flexible and capable of including the deities of subject peoples in its own pantheon. There was a religious way of symbolizing the domination that had been imposed. An enclosure in the great temple of Tenochtitlan where the sacred images of defeated peoples were preserved. It was rather like a prison for captured divinities. Local cults were neither prohibited nor prosecuted, nor was the existence of local gods denied, although the Aztecs did insist on expressing the superiority of their own deities. Even so, there was nothing like a missionary spirit seeking the conversion of the dominated to the religion of the Aztecs. The only exceptions were some late attempts to introduce the cult of Huitzilopochtli, the most characteristic Aztec god, as one more representative in the polytheistic pantheons of other peoples. This way of dealing with religious differences in the process of domination becomes clear when one takes into account that all Mesoamerican religious systems are the result of the same process of civilizational development. Over centuries and millennia, there was constant contact and mutual influence. Thus, we can recognize the same deity among different peoples and in different epochs. Well-known examples include Tlaloc and Quetzalcoatl from the Central Plateau, who became Chac and Colculcan among the Maya of Yucatan, and an older god of fire, who appears in diverse cultures. There are common patterns beneath the conceptions and religious systems of Mesoamerican peoples, which make them compatible rather than mutually exclusive. Perhaps it is in this context that we can better understand a complex of practices that have to do with religion and warfare, and that are always mentioned to demonstrate the quote-unquote barbarity of Mesoamerican civilization. I refer, of course, to the so-called War of Flowers and to ritual human sacrifice. The very idea that two peoples could come together periodically to battle for prisoners in order to sacrifice them for religious purposes makes sense only if one does not look at it as an isolated fact to be explained, but rather as part of a complete cultural system shared by all the peoples involved. Different groups had to share similar conceptions about the universe and about the transcendental human obligations necessary for maintaining the continuity of the cosmos in order to participate periodically in a ritual that culminated in the sacrifice of some number of their best men. Otherwise, the War of Flowers would have been to the death, since death on the battlefield would have made more sense than death in the enemy's temple. The common background of Mesoamerican civilization provided the shared ideas that made acceptable what today, from the outside, seems incomprehensible. Let me make two additional points to conclude this general description of the forms of pre-colonial domination in Mexico. One refers to the fact that there were no qualitative differences in military technology between different Mesoamerican peoples. The arms used were similar, and the advantage was given by the number of men who fought on each side rather than by the potency of their armament. Based on a certain level of demographic size and unfavorable geographic factors, peoples of the region could maintain sufficient military strength to resist the invasion of any outsider. This is demonstrated by the persistence of autonomous kingdoms in the interior of the territory dominated by the Aztecs right up until the time of the Spanish invasion. The second point has to do with the linguistic policy practiced by the Mexica relative to subject peoples who spoke a language other than Nahuatl. There was no attempt to impose the language of the victors. Nahuatlization was not one of the objectives of domination. From these facts, as in the case of religious policy, one finds a notion of the other peoples, enemies, or allies, subjects or not, that does not involve a conception of natural and absolute inferiority. Even further, the cultural differences between peoples are not used to justify domination. Had this been true, there would have been efforts to quote-unquote civilize those defeated. What we see is in fact an acceptance of the other's way of life, of their productive systems, of their religious beliefs, of their forms of government, and of their languages. None of these things have to be eliminated or excluded. All are compatible with the system and objectives of domination. A common civilization makes possible the subjugation of a people without implying the negation or illegitimacy of their culture. The colonial system established by the Spaniards was of a completely different nature from the forms of domination known up to that point in Mesoamerica. The dominant Western ideology was accentuated in the case of Spain, which came fresh from the experience of the wars of reconquest against the Moors. It conceived the subjugation of peoples with non-European cultures as an undeniable right derived from the obligation of disseminating the Christian faith to all peoples. During the invasion period, this missionary impulse gained new vigor in Catholic countries as a result of the schism in Christendom that resulted from Luther's reforms. In various ways, the papacy encouraged enterprises of conquest, which were understood as redemptory crusades. In this climate, the conception of the other was naturally that of an inferior being. It reached the point of questioning or even denying the humanity of the other, which in the terms of the time meant questioning the possession of an eternal soul. This ideological conception fit well with the less spiritual interests of colonial European expansion. It was a way of arguing that presented Christian civilization as the only possibility for salvation, but included under the same mantle the desire for precious metals, spices, territory, and a labor force, all of which would rapidly enrich the economies of the metropolitan regions. The natural superiority assumed by the colonizer was not limited to his conviction that he possessed the only true faith. His religious convictions necessarily became an affirmation of superiority in all other areas of life. Material aspirations, the way of understanding progress in human duty, the criteria for distinguishing good from evil, and the desirable from that to be rejected. The correct and incorrect ways of thinking and doing things and behaving all constituted a whole that was postulated globally as superior. It was a unique way because it was the only way. Within this ideological context, a technology of war and domination more efficient than that employed by the Mesoamerican peoples was put at the surface of a program radically different from that of pre-colonial domination. It is thus clear that the structure of power imposed by the Spaniards and the consequent system of cultural control implanted by colonial society constituted a new form of domination, unknown to that point in these lands in terms of both procedures and consequences. The difference from previous situations was radical. The colonial order was by nature exclusive. It rested on the cultural incompatibility of colonized and colonizers. The purposes of colonization were fulfilled only to the extent that those colonized changed their ways of life to adjust them to the needs and interests of the colonial enterprise. These required changes, however, did not lead to the assimilation of the colonized into the dominant culture, but only to their adaptation to their new role as conquered and colonized peoples. The difference between the two groups was maintained because upon it rested the justification for colonial domination. Exclusion meant that the dominated culture was not recognized as having any value of its own. It was a culture denied, one that was incompatible. Those colonized were not subjugated in order to take away what they made or produced, but to force them to make or produce something different. Here we see the profound difference between the colonial order imposed in the 16th century and the previous forms of domination. In the new subjugation, the other was denied. His cultural vision of the future not only were incompatible, they did not exist. Exclusion was evident in the system of cultural control imposed, itself a result of the imposition of a different civilization. The creation of the Indian. Before the European invasion, each one of the peoples who occupied the territory that today is Mexico had a particular, clearly identified social and ethnic identity. No conception existed of the subjugated peoples as inferior or as intrinsically different, even during the last decades of the Mexica expansion. The nomads of the north, known generically as Chichimeca, were distinguished as a category of people, and the term Chichimeca was undeniably pejorative. Nevertheless, even in this case, the fact that the Aztecs themselves were of nomadic origin made it difficult to conceptualize the Chichimeca as naturally inferior. The Indian is the product of the establishment of the colonial regime. Before the invasion, there were no Indians, but individually identified peoples. Colonial society, on the other hand, rested on a categorical division between two irreconcilable poles: the Spaniards, the colonizers, and the Indians, the colonized. In this scheme of things, the individuality of each of the subjugated peoples passed to a second level and lost all meaning. The only fundamental distinction was that which was made all of them the others, that is to say, those who were not Spaniards. During the early years of the colony, New Spain was conceived as a society with two republics, that of the Indians and that of the Spaniards. Each one was subject to different orders, which established and codified what should be its internal life, and the ways in which it would relate to the other republic. The relationship, of course, was not between two equal republics, but between a dominant society, which believed itself superior in all ways, and a republic of Indians, which was therefore defined as inferior. The viceroy, Don Luis de Velasco, wrote in 1559, "The two republics of which this kingdom consists, that of Spaniards and that of Indians, experience great repugnance and difficulty in their relations with each other, in terms of their government, their growth, and their stability. The maintenance of the first always seems to involve the oppression and destruction of the second. The quote-unquote natural order postulated by St. Thomas fit perfectly as an ideological justification for inequality, subjugation, and exploitation of the quote-unquote miserable serfs, the colonized or the Indians. Since its beginnings, the category of Indian has been shameful, denoting a natural and irredeemable inferiority. In the ideological climate of the times, what was natural could only be understood as the inscrutable will of divine providence. The Indian, Gascon or Maya, Otomi or Aztec, was necessarily inferior to the white Christian European, and that inferiority destined him to a subordinate position in society. They would be, quote, the humble but necessary feet of the Republic, end quote. At the shock of discovering the other, the first debate was about its humanity. Once this was admitted, the norms began to be elaborated and the practices accumulated that would turn the presumption of inferiority, postulated ideologically, into a real social inferiority within the colonial world. In certain fundamental ways, the Indian was perceived not just as inferior, but as the incarnation of evil itself. This is particularly clear in relation to Indian religions, conceptions, and practices which were attributed to the direct intervention of the devil. This was either because he had always reigned in these lands far from the hand of God, or because in his astuteness he had managed to corrupt the achievements of an early evangelical mission attributed to the apostle St. Thomas, who was tentatively identified with the figure of Quetzalcoatl. In any case, the quote-unquote idolatries expressed evil itself and not just natural inferiority. On the one hand, the king had the paternal obligation to look after the Indian as a vassal, but on the other, the Indian ruled by the devil had to be fought, persecuted, and punished. This double condition attributed to those colonized allowed every possible method of coercion to be used to force the new protagonist, the Indian, into the role destined for him in colonial society. The indiscriminate incorporation of diverse Mesoamerican peoples into the common category of quote-unquote Indian led to a series of processes that effectively reduced many of their differences. In the end, the result was a greater uniformity among Indian cultures than had existed in pre-colonial times. The higher levels of Mesoamerican social organization were destroyed, including those that corresponded to the state, the kingdom, and the ethnic groups beyond the community level. The ruling groups, the priests and wise men, and political and military leaders were all eliminated, in many cases quite literally. Only in the restricted confines of the local community could some former patterns of authority exist, now put to the service of the colonizers. During the first decades, the territorial units of the Aztec Empire, defined as a head community and its outliers, were still used to collect tribute and to organize forced labor parties through the repartimiento. They were also used to fix parish boundaries. Later on, these divisions lost significance, and the local community was left as the only social space where the continuity of Mesoamerican civilization was possible. Little by little, the ancient social stratification of the Indian world dissolved in a social universe newly leveled downward, toward the level previously occupied by the Masehuales and the sub-Masehuales. It is true that the caciques and principales of many communities remain converted into intermediaries of the colonial power. They were recognized as legitimate authorities with privileges that many used for their own benefit and for their personal enrichment. However, historically, this group suffered one of two fates. Either it became Hispanicized, adding to the ranks of the mestizos who had renounced their Indian identity, or it lost importance as an intermediary group and thereby lost its internal authority, incorporated itself into the mass of other Indians, and shared their condition. The tendency for social leveling of the Indians was inevitable within the colonial order. Many aspects of Indian policy were aimed at achieving that leveling. Prohibitions and obligations were established, at least in terms of the letter of the law, in general form for all Indians: tribute, obligatory work, boundary markings, resettlement of populations, community organization, clothing, religious duties, and so on. In practice, different realities imposed themselves, but the aspiration of colonial society was undoubtedly to create a uniform, well-defined whole, which included all those of the social category that through error or ignorance was called Indian. Colonial society was conceived as a simple duality. One group, the Indians, served the principal function of serving and enriching the others, the Spaniards. However, from the beginning, unforeseen groups were present. First, there were black slaves brought from Africa, who became a problem when they escaped and became outlaw groups living in palenques, remote, self-governing communities. They came out only to ravage the highways, putting travelers and commerce at risk. Soon afterward came the mestizos and the castas, that inconvenient but necessary mixed group who formed the common people of the cities. They also wandered all over the land, without destination and living apart from the rule of law. In spite of the elaborate attempts to classify the castas and assign to each one a clear position in the stratified order of colonial society, those who were neither Spaniards, peninsulares, or criollos, nor Indians never found precise placement in a society that rested on the rigid dual order of colonized and colonizers. Even though the castas were formally defined by the percentage of different blood they carried, American, African, and European, in reality it was social criteria, not biological, that defined the different groups. Undoubtedly, a large number of racial mestizos who were born and grew up in Indian communities were considered Indians. In the same way, many racially pure Indians passed for mestizos when they left their communities of origin and became serfs or free laborers. Some mestizos were taken for Creoles, and the passage from one group to the other had less to do with relative purity of blood than with the other social factors, among which wealth was especially important. The miserably poor Spaniards formed part of the common people, intermixed with the castas. In the haciendas, mines, and workshops, the mulattoes and mestizos were frequently the bosses and overseers in charge of supervising and enforcing the work required of the slaves and Indians. In a detailed analysis, which has still not been done, it would be possible to place the numbers of the castas, according to regions and time periods, within one or the other of the two fundamental universes composing colonial society, the Indians and the Spaniards. This does not imply ignoring the real social and cultural differences that separated the castas from both sides. Rather, it implies understanding their participation in the new Hispanic society, beginning from the fundamental, inescapable dichotomy of colonial society. The non-existence of a new mestizo society, representing the fusion of the societies of Mesoamerica and the West, is a point to which I will return in the pages that follow. The initial violence. The conquest was a violent invasion. This violence, physical, bloody, brutal violence, was not an initial episode. It has been a permanent marker of relations with Indian peoples from the 16th century until the present. The subjugation of Anahuac was achieved through blood and fire, as would be the occupation of the rest of the territory. The slaughterers at Cholula and in the Templo Mayor are at the beginnings of our era. Just so, they were treacherously slain, deceitfully slain, unknowingly slain. From the material point of view, the violence was imposed by the deadly superiority of Spanish arms and tactics of war. Diego Muñoz Camargo relates that the Tlaxcaltecans sent by Cortés to Cholula to ask that the Spaniards be received peacefully, said that if the Spaniards were angered, they were very ferocious, brave, and daring people who carried superior weapons, powerful steel weapons. The same chronicler comments, quote, "They said this because the Cholutecans did not have iron but only copper, and the Spaniards also brought firearms and fierce animals on leashes tied with cords of iron, and they wore clothes and shoes of iron, and they carried powerful crossbows and lions and leopards that ate people, as they called the mastiffs and greyhounds, that our people did in fact bring, and that were very effective." End quote. Firearms, horses, armament, helmets, iron swords and lances, attack dogs. These elements define the military superiority of the Spaniards against the Indians. The superiority was carefully maintained and employed whenever necessary during the 3 centuries of the colony. Military force meant superior killing ability, and it was the pillar that sustained the colonial order, the ultimate and unopposable basis of domination. However, arms do not kill by themselves, and those who use them must have motives for killing. The venturesome conquistadors had a primary motive, which was gold, silver, and quick riches. These would give them the honor they had not achieved in Spain. But this motive required other acceptable justifications for the violence with which it was achieved. The invaders considered the use of violence legitimate because the ideology of the conquest and colonial domination offered pertinent arguments. They were fighting against idolatry in the name of a king named as patron of the Indies by the Pope himself. War was just because it led finally to the salvation of the conquered. In this temporal world, the Indians, vassals of the king, could not elude the violence directed against them when it was carried out because of the superior and indisputable interests of the crown. And the interests of the king were necessarily the interests of his loyal vassals as well. During the first half century of domination, there were conflicts between missionaries and encomenderos, who had been given rights to Indian labor, over the violence with which the latter treated the Indians. One of the most angry voices of protest was that of Fray Bartolomé de las Casas. Quote, "Oh, if one could only make others understand 100th part of the afflictions and calamities that those innocent people suffer from the wretched Spaniards. May God give understanding to those who could and should rectify this situation. Santiago and after them, they shout. And with naked swords they begin to open those naked and delicate bodies and to spill that freely given blood." The opposition of the priests weakened beginning in the last third of the 16th century, when the encomienda lost importance and the religious orders themselves found their place in the colonial order. They became more concerned with the defense of their own interests and privileges than with the well-being of the Indians. The mortality of the Indian population during the first century of the colony provoked the most brutal demographic catastrophe in history. S.F. Cook and W. Bora have arrived at the following estimates of the Indian population of central Mexico. 1518, 25.2 million inhabitants. 1532, 16.8 million. 1568, 2.7 million. 1605, 1.4 million. Other estimates indicate that the population of the Valley of Mexico decreased from approximately 3 million inhabitants in 1519 to only 70,000 by the middle of the 17th century. The first years after the fall of Tenochtitlan left a horrifying balance, since by 1524 only 1/3 of the original inhabitants were left. The Indian population began growing slowly, beginning in the middle of the 17th century, but it was well into the present century before Mexico reached a population similar to that inhabiting the territory in 1519. These are the facts. To military violence must be added other causes, other forms of violence that help explain a genocide that is otherwise inconceivable. There were epidemics caused by diseases brought by the invaders and unknown in the pre-colonial world, and to which the Indians had no resistance. The epidemics began at the very start of the conquest among the defenders of Tlatelolco, and continued during the whole colonial period, causing a terrible mortality among the Indian population. Malasawat, probably the exanthematic typhus, attacked only the Indian population and occurred at least 32 times during the colony. Population declines, the loss of farmland, and the immoderate tribute requirements impoverished the communities, lowering and unbalancing the original food supply and leaving the population even more vulnerable to disease. The new conditions of life and work imposed by the colonizers also brought death. The initial slavery, which was maintained as a legal practice for the quote unquote rebellious Indians of the North, the forced labor in the encomiendas, and later in repartimientos, all subjected Indians to an implacable and withering decline. The massive relocations of the colonized peoples, referred to as reducciones and congregaciones, profoundly altered life habits. They upset the Indian universe in ways that were often intolerable. Alcoholism became widespread. Quote, few peoples in the whole of history, were more prone to drunkenness than the Indians of the Spanish colony, concludes Gibson in his study of the Aztecs under Spanish domination. Collective suicides, systematic abortion, and conjugal abstinence denote, as Alejandra Moreno points out, an indifference, a lack of interest in life because these Indians are imaginative, and seeing themselves uprooted, they go to the hills and die from pure pain and sadness, end quote. Colonial violence also included the struggles induced between the Indians themselves. Cortés assaulted Tenochtitlan with 900 Spaniards and 150,000 Indian allies. Muñoz Camargo indicates the manner in which the Tlaxcaltecans were convinced, quote, there was a city such killing and destruction as to defy imagination. Thus our friends learn of the courage of us Spaniards, and thenceforward they did not consider committing greater crimes, all guided by divine order, and our Lord was served by this land being won and rescued from the power of the devil. Afterward, the armies that were employed to extend the frontiers of the colony were formed of Indians giving encomienda service, or of Indians from communities forced to provide service even if it meant death. The conflicts between villages over boundaries and water, which have been a constant source of violence in rural Mexico, originated in the erratic colonial policy that established boundaries and assigned lands. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that this policy was conscious and was destined to provoke divisions and confrontations that prevented any eventual unification of Indians against the Spaniards. Corporal punishment was the norm, not the exception. It was applied to Indians by encomenderos, hacendados, foremen of mines and workshops, Indian caciques themselves, and the clergy. The stocks and the whip were a common experience of those colonized, and there were also more drastic punishments up to and including shameful murders. The violence against Indians reached such extremes that it disgusted even the conquistadors themselves. Alejandra Moreno points out that quite a number of them ended their lives secluded in monasteries. One soldier, Lerma, who gave his name to the river, preferred to go away with the Indians, a new Gonzalo Guerrero, and nothing more was ever heard of him. Violence in all its forms was present in the colony. It was not an abnormal, an unusual, or an avoidable occurrence, but rather a necessary condition. It was the only possible way to subjugate the Indians to the rule of the whites. Violence was omnipresent and total, like the colonial situation itself. This persistent, deep-rooted violence has stained the life of independent and contemporary Mexico. Violence and colonization were inseparable and mutually reinforcing. With the sword, the cross. If violence was the primary and ultimate recourse for assuring domination, religion was its inseparable companion. This was so partly because of the ideological justification religion offered for conquest and colonization. In addition, the clergy and the ecclesiastical hierarchy played a major role in exercising control over the Indian population. The church had a much more important colonizing task than the army, at least until the last decades of the 18th century. Historians customarily distinguish a first period of missionary activity in New Spain, which concludes about 1570. It was the epoch of the quote-unquote spiritual conquest carried out by the mendicant orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinians. The clergy took in their hands the tasks of pacification and disputed among themselves and with the military and civilian colonizers over control of the Indians. A profound contradiction became apparent between the spiritual goals of the conquest and its material goals. The friars waged the battle on different fronts. They tried to keep the Indians isolated from morally pernicious contact with the Spaniards. They denounced the abuses of the encomenderos. They founded schools to prepare a new, obedient, and Christian elite from the surviving children of the Indian nobility. They even aspired, as Robert Ricard has shown, to found a new indigenous church with its own priests and bishops. Some of them wanted to create a utopia here, a true kingdom of God on earth. Nevertheless, none of this made their evangelizing mission a process that tended to negate the essence of colonization. They did not represent an alternative, but rather different modalities and different hierarchies of values in the exercise of colonial domination. For them as well, the Indian was an inferior being, an eternal minor, a soul to be saved in spite of himself, if necessary, and by whatever means available, including violence. Any means were legitimate to achieve such lofty ends. The first young people who were Christianized were obligated to denounce the idolatries of their own people, and they formed bands to destroy the idols. The priests needed effective control over the Indian population for the success of their mission, as much as did the conquistadors, who were anxious to derive more tangible, immediate, and earthly benefits. The communities were nominally subject to the power of the king, but in reality they were much more directly beneath the control of the priests. The sense of property that the priests developed in relation to the Indians became absolute. On occasion, they employed their Indians as a frontline force to expel friars of another order who had the temerity to establish themselves in what the first group of priests considered their private hunting preserve. A preserve, of course, for hunting souls. These internal struggles also involved other less pious motives, such as access to tithes and to the various personal services provided by the Indians. To enjoy the benefits of that century, the priests were not averse to the use of violence. In 1539, for instance, the ecclesiastical board felt it necessary to prohibit priests from seizing or beating Indians. The work to which the missionaries put the Indians involved very different activities. New crops and agricultural techniques were introduced, as they were practiced in Spain, and various trades were introduced that were necessary to the life of the colony and unknown until then in the Mesoamerican world. A first task given to the Indians was to build churches and convents, which multiplied rapidly across the face of New Spain. There were stronghold convents in the interior of Indian Territory and sumptuous churches in the cities and mining towns. Accusations among the various orders and between the orders and the secular clergy were exchanged regularly. In 1563, Father Maturino Gilberti accused Tata himself, Bishop Vasco de Quiroga, of, among other things, being involved in the construction of a sumptuous cathedral that would be impossible to finish and that would be to the detriment of the Indians of the Michoacan Lake region. Indians, in fact, rebelled against the excessive work on religious buildings. Gibson relates that in 1557 the Indians of Teotihuacan burned the image of St. Augustine and reacted violently against the Augustinians, who wanted them to build a convent that would require as much labor as had Alcoman. The Indians demanded and achieved the return of the Franciscans, who were apparently less grandiose in their architectural ambitions. To organize work, collect tithes, ensure that doctrine was taught, and watch over the conduct of the new Christians, the priests intervened heavily in the internal life of the communities. They established systems of annual post or cargoes for service in the churches, which were based to some extent on earlier forms of local organization. They established the cofradias, or organizations devoted to the worship of particular saints, which were quite different from those in the Spanish communities. In Mexico, they did not correspond to trade guilds, but rather had responsibility for the financing of festivities and offered their members some financial security. For example, they paid the costs of Christian burial. Frequently, the priests were in control of the community treasuries, where tribute from the Indians was collected and dispersed, and reserved a small amount for emergencies and internal fiestas. It should not be surprising, given the priests' constant interference in community affairs, that they should become the true local authorities. They had almost universal, unlimited powers to designate or remove Indian office holders in the civil organization, as much as in the organizations dedicated to religious affairs. Behind their authority stood the Holy Office, that is, the Inquisition, established first in 1536 and then permanently in 1571. It should be pointed out that in the Society of New Spain, this tribunal had a much wider sphere of activities than its ecclesiastic nature would suggest. In the best moments of the first phase of evangelization, A convergence between the achievements of Mesoamerican and Western civilizations seemed possible. Ricard points out that this possibility in his analysis of the educational and research efforts of the Franciscans and their Indian disciples in the school of Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco. Nevertheless, faced with the hostility of the crown and of many spokesmen of the Dominican orders themselves, this enterprise was soon abandoned. As with the project of creating an indigenous church, the possible dialogue between civilizations was aborted. The Council of 1555 prohibited the ordination of Indians, mestizos, and blacks. It would not be until the middle of the 17th century that the first Indian priests appeared sporadically, without any mission of their own, and without access to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The imperious reality of the colonial order imposed itself, making no concessions whatsoever. Another fact that should be remembered is that Christianization was quite superficial. According to Father Pedro de Gante, between 1524 and 1536, 5 million Indians were baptized in New Spain. Motolinia alone insisted that he had baptized around 400,000. The consequences were foreseeable and did not go unperceived by the more perspicacious Father Bernardo de Sahagún says, even after having preached to them for more than 50 years, if they were now left by themselves, I believe that in fewer than 50 years there would be no trace left of the preaching they have received. End quote. The poor results of evangelization seem to apply even to the Indians who had had the best and most lasting religious instruction. A celebrated cacique of Texcoco, a former student of the Tlatelolco school, was condemned to death by the Inquisition for propagating idolatry and obstructing the triumph of the Holy Faith. In the tasks of evangelization, the priests were not operating in a simple world. Rather, they worked in societies that had a formally established religion, deep-rooted over the centuries and profoundly interwoven into all aspects of their lives. There were formal similarities between certain Mesoamerican and Christian ritual practices. Some priests saw in these similarities the remains of an early evangelization 1,500 years before the arrival of the Spaniards. Others, Sahagún among them, totally rejected this supposition and dedicated themselves to the total uprooting of Indian religious ideas and practices, however similar they might seem to Catholic ones. This was the position that finally predominated, but there was no way to avoid recognizing in practice the presence of the Mesoamerican religions. The attempt was to manipulate them as a shortcut toward true conversion. The temples and idols that could be seen were destroyed. In 1531, Zumarraga reported the destruction of 500 temples and 20,000 idols, but frequently the new Christian temples were built on the sites formerly occupied by the ancient quests, or temples, which had been leveled, or on top of pyramids. Many of the great sanctuaries that thousands of pilgrims visit today are built on the exact spots where Mesoamerican temples stood that also attracted pilgrims from all directions and from great distances. This is the case with Tepeyac, Chalma, Amecameca, and Cholula, to mention only a few. Quote-unquote idols behind altars is more than an apt rhetorical phrase. In another area, the friars had to permit the use of the dances and songs that formed an indispensable part of Mesoamerican ritual. They changed the words, of course, and introduced new instruments, rhythms, and melodies, but the mitotes, or ritual dances and songs, continued and still continue as an obligatory ingredient in religious celebrations. During several decades, the priests learned and employed the Indian languages in their evangelizing tasks, in spite of the fear of some who saw in that practice the danger of continuity in prior beliefs and a twisted interpretation of the Christian message. Nahuatl was the preferred tongue, and its teaching was proposed as a general method of facilitating preaching in all of New Spain. To a large extent, the Nahuatlization that can be observed in many parts of the country resulted more from missionary action than from Aztec expansion. In addition, the use of Indian languages facilitated another sort of goal. It gave the priests exclusive control, since they were the only ones who knew the languages of the conquered. The ability to communicate was converted into a means of control and domination. In addition, territorial demarcation of the regions converted to Christianity, and the general work of evangelizing was frequently based on the territorial units that existed before the European invasion. This made possible the continuity of local forms of social organization within small regions, as long as the missionaries could find a way of using them for their own purposes. Even particular Mesoamerican religious traits, such as the existence of local deities, found a place in the new order. Each barrio, cattle ranch, or village came to have its own patron saint. The shrines built to venerate these tutelary images were important reference points for maintaining the communal identity of the Indian people, and they gained importance with the decline or destruction of broader social units. The slow abandonment of the initial missionary spirit in the last third of the 16th century makes the church in New Spain appear plainly as an agent of domination. In Ricard's words, quote, "What was founded, before all and above all, was a Spanish church, organized on a Spanish model, directed by Spaniards, and where the indigenous people played to some degree the role of second-class Christians. In summary, a Spanish church was superimposed on an indigenous Christianity. The church in Mexico appeared finally not as something emanating from Mexico herself, but as something coming from the metropolis, something from outside, a foreign framework applied to an indigenous community. It was not a national church, but a colonial church, given that Mexico was a colony and not a nation." End quote. The Jesuits, who arrived in 1572, brought with them the spirit of the Counter-Reformation and concentrated their attention on the Creole population. The secular clergy displaced the early missionaries, and the mendicant orders were sent off to facilitate and consolidate the colonization of huge territories in the northern provinces. It was not unusual to find friars who became rich, hung up their habits, and returned to Spain. The church quickly became the major landholder in New Spain, and in that role the Jesuits were particularly conspicuous until their expulsion. Slowly, the image of the missionary stopped being that of protector of the Indians, or the least harmful option. The rift between priests and Indians reached the point of rupture and open hostility. Nevertheless, there were uprisings against the expulsion of the Jesuits, which were put down and punished with more than customary violence. The church, in its differing ways of operating, maintained itself until the end of colonial times as a basic institution for the control of the Indians. The Indian, a useful object. Colonization was an enterprise of exploitation. The extraction of material riches was the colonizing society's primary and permanent goal. The priest's pursuit of spiritual objectives in the early period was not opposed to material enrichment, but was rather an additional endeavor. It never really challenged the colonial enterprise and ended by being an ideological argument used in certain circumstances to defend existing oppression. It never altered in the least the daily exploitation. The objects of exploitation were the colonized, the Indians. The definition of their role in society of New Spain, above and beyond the interminable legal discussions, was that of miserable subjects of His Majesty. They were obligated to create the wealth that would be enjoyed by the colonizers, here and on the other side of the Atlantic. The social, economic, political, legal, and ideological organization of New Spain was an immense and complex apparatus that responded, ultimately, to one simple goal. It ensured the exploitation of the Indians. The Indian was useful to the extent that he was converted into an object of exploitation. He was a hostile enemy when he tried to evade exploitation or threaten its success. He was treated indifferently or ignored when he remained on the margin of the occupied, the useful, the exploited Mexico. In this case, he was only someone with the potential to be colonized. There were two principal mechanisms for the utilization and exploitation of the Indians: tribute and work. Both rested ultimately on the physical and intellectual efforts of the Indians. However, the distinction is convenient because work was employed on Spanish projects in which each Indian counted individually as a unit of physical labor. Tribute, on the other hand, was extracted from the wealth generated in the communities, using all their resources, their land, their forms of organization, their knowledge, their abilities, all of their culture. This difference is important because it has implications for the continuity of Mesoamerican civilization, as we will discuss shortly. Tribute was imposed from the very beginning, although its forms and amounts changed over 3 centuries. Legally, it was founded on the presumption that the quote-unquote discovered lands belonged to the crown. The original inhabitants were then crown subjects who, through tribute, compensated the king for his generous concession in allowing them use of the lands. During the first decades of the colony, the conquistadors were compensated by granting them encomiendas, which meant the right to receive the tribute and work of a larger or smaller number of Indians, and the obligation to protect them and instruct them in the Christian faith. At the outset, each encomendero fixed the amount of tribute according to his own judgment. Usually it was done by calculating the harvest and estimating the minimum of tributaries needed for their subsistence during the year. Everything left over constituted the tribute. Later, laws were established that tried to define with more precision who the tributaries were and to establish uniform rates for tribute payments. Payment in labor was also prohibited, obliging the tributary to pay in money and not in kind. The attempt was thus to involve the Indians in the monetary economy of the colonizers. The tribute belonged originally to the crown. The king gave encomiendas to those he judged worthy of them, but the division was not equal. The military captains of the conquest received the greatest number and passed some on to their favorite subordinates. Other conquistadors received smaller encomiendas and some none at all. Hernan Cortes was conceded a vast domain to which even he had legal property rights, unlike the encomenderos. The encomienda did not imply owning Indians as property, thus distinguishing the encomendados from slaves. However, in practice, it was difficult to recognize the distinction, and the crown finally decided to abolish the encomiendas. Crown rights over Indian vassals were reaffirmed, thus avoiding the danger that the royal colonies would be transformed into small kingdoms in which the only real power would be exercised by the encomenderos. The tribute returned to the king. Tribute enriched the metropolis and maintained the colony. Before the different charges imposed on the Indians were unified into a single tributary quota, they had to be paid separately to the crown and the encomendero, to the priests in charge of evangelization, and to local political leaders and caciques. All this was in addition to contributions to the community, and to assessments and special tribute required for all sorts of purposes. When the crown finally decided to directly assume the costs of evangelization and civil administration, it did not signify any improvement whatsoever for the tributaries. They now paid one tribute quota that included all the same charges as before, and others that were incorporated as the years went by. In many cases, payment did not exempt them from the obligation to pay special assessments and costs, frequently organized through underhanded arrangements with corregidores and alcaldes mayores, or local colonial officials, governors and judges, with caciques, and with other functionaries of every imaginable stripe. In any case, tribute provided the funds to finance the civil and religious government of the colony, the growing wealth of civil and religious bureaucrats, and the European wars of the Spanish king. When tribute began to be collected in money and not in kind, the Indians were obligated somehow to obtain the necessary funds. Paid work outside the community was one possibility, as was the sale of local products or the rental of communal lands. The individual tributary amounts were deposited in a community treasury, or caja de comunidad, which at the beginning was administered by the priests. From these treasuries, most of the funds went to pay tribute, and a small remaining portion was left for community expenses, especially for financing religious fiestas. Local governors and members of the Indian councils, or cabildos, were given sinecures and privileges that were also derived in part from the tribute. They were also given responsibilities. At the end of the 16th century, the tributary debts of the community were considered personal debts of the local governor and council, and they were hereditary. In order to avoid such risks, Indian authorities resorted to measures that were contrary to Spanish norms but corresponded to ancient practice. For example, instead of charging all the tributaries equal amounts, they established different taxation according to the rank of each individual and the lands he possessed. In this way, the income of the community was linked to and reinforced in its internal social organization. The other mechanism of exploitation, as mentioned above, was work. Obligatory work existed in the pre-colonial period and fulfilled similar functions, but it had different characteristics. Gibson points out that before the invasion, work was a collective obligation whose nature was gratifying and enjoyable, as opposed to the European conception in which the implications of coercion and slavery were prominent. It was from this latter perspective, evidently, that work obligations were imposed on the Indians. The Indians worked for the colonizing Spaniards. The methods varied. In the early decades, as indicated, the encomenderos and the corregidores exacted work in addition to tribute. By the middle of the 16th century, the decrease in Indian population made it necessary to seek other alternatives to make use of the scarce labor force. Repartimiento was a system controlled by the civil authorities of the viceroy. It distributed Indian labor for the benefit of a large number of Spaniards, thus limiting the privileges of the encomenderos. Taking advantage of ancient Mesoamerican customs, work obligations were established in rotating fashion for the communities in accordance with the territorial units that existed before the conquest. Work through repartimiento was officially designated for works of public utility, but this definition was sufficiently lax to cover all the particular necessities of the Spaniards in return for modest wages. The Indians on repartimiento built the cities, served as porters for heavy burdens, worked in the mines, cultivated the haciendas that were beginning to cover the countryside, took care of the cattle, served as domestic labor, and died in battles in the name of their masters or in drainage works to save them from floods. Repartimiento, unlike the pre-colonial cuaquetl, or obligatory communal work, did not recognize or make use of the work specialization existing in the communities. At the beginning, all did the same work, which was whatever was required. The channels of communal organization were used to recruit the workers, who were then used individually and according to the needs of the moment. In their compulsory labor, the Indians were only a mechanical force applied to tasks indiscriminately. The objectives and interests to be served by the tasks were determined exclusively by the Spaniards. There was also free labor, although for the Indian that quote-unquote freedom was a forced option, limited by many circumstances of colonial domination. The Spanish haciendas required a labor force that repartimiento could not satisfy, above all, given the drastic decrease in the Indian population. The hacendados hired farmhands and became involved in conflicts and arrangements with the Indian governors and with the corregidores and repartimiento officials to ensure that their peons were not obligated to work in some other place. The textile factories and flour mills also required permanent workers. There, the work conditions were so bad that it was necessary to bring prisoners to work off their sentences in the mills. Domestic service employed slaves and also free workers called navorios. In the mines and plantations, Indians worked for wages, almost always under the direction of foremen who belonged to the castas, preferably mulattoes or mestizos. The Indian navorios, like the peons of the haciendas, very quickly became tied to their employers for life. They were never able to repay the debts they owed for loans their employers made to them. In Mexico City, the Indians quickly learned the Spanish trades. They exercised them with dexterity and incorporated them into their own forms of social organization. Trades were taught within the family, and each barrio maintained its own specialty. The Indian workers' competence was such that Spanish artisans defended themselves by organizing guilds from which Indians were excluded, or within which, at least, they could never reach the level of master. The impoverishment and excessive exploitation of the communities resulted in many Indians leaving them and trying to make a living as free workers. The tribute and forced labor requirements, the special obligations imposed arbitrarily, and the frequent mistreatment by Spaniards and Indian authorities went along with the loss of community lands coveted by the haciendas and with low prices for marketable products. The community, which continued to be the major area for Indian continuity, saw its capacity to maintain all those born within it reduced. The loss of lands was the limiting factor for the communities of occupied Mexico, the Mexico used for colonial exploitation. The haciendas were the principal instrument of exploitation. They were the first devoted to the products brought by the colonizers, wheat, sugarcane, cattle, and others of lesser importance. Soon, however, they expropriated from the Indians several of the major Mesoamerican crops, such as corn and maguey. They finally controlled the market for those products as well. The huge extensions of land that the haciendas accumulated were of course taken from the original Indian holdings. Faced with the voracity of the haciendas, the communities' land were demarcated, but very strictly and without taking population increase into account. By the middle of the 17th century, the Indian population began to recuperate, meaning that the new arrivals were more likely to be born as peons on the haciendas than as communal farmers. In addition, even the lands formerly assigned to the Indians were coveted by the hacendados and were frequently taken away through violence or with the complicity of Indian governors or caciques, some of whom became large landholders themselves. The rapid increase in cattle raising also affected the communities. Conflict over damages to Indian fields caused by herds of cattle has been incessant from the 16th century to the present day. The land changed owners and also destinies. Wheat replaced corn and milpa products on the best land. Irrigation water went to Spanish cultivation and not to Indian agriculture. Cattle, horses, sheep, and goats occupied lands that had been agricultural, and the hillsides which were rapidly deforested. Erosion increased on the Central Plateau, along with Spanish occupation, which had an insatiable appetite for wood. It was used for construction, firewood for households, scaffolding for mines, and fuel for various purposes. Many hacienda lands were left uncultivated as a symbol of the honor and wealth of the large landed estates. Great extensions were used only for planting magueys. Pulque was drunk by Indians, but produced by the haciendas. Since in 1749, planting magueys on community lands was prohibited. Grapes, olives, and indigo were introduced, but had little effect, except in small areas. The advance of the haciendas and the desire to avoid the most direct ties with colonization led to many communities to retreat to distant and inhospitable zones, which Aguirre Beltran has appropriately labeled refuge regions. Even there, with the passage of time, the Indians found their lands besieged and threatened. The priests, who had opposed the encomienda system, in part because they were prohibited from becoming encomenderos themselves, never tried to stop the growth of the haciendas, which was so detrimental to the Indian communities. The church was a major landholder in New Spain, and the Jesuits were the most prosperous and enterprising hacendados. The flock of Indian souls under their care, in turn, took care of the flocks of cattle and the crops of their spiritual pastors. Commerce was also a means of exploiting Indians. In the early colonial years, they were supposed to provision the cities with agricultural products, not only through tribute in kind, but also by selling necessary food items. In 1579, each Indian family was required to raise 12 hens and 5 turkeys to guarantee a supply of eggs and fowl for Spanish consumption. Fruit and vegetables produced on the Chinampas in the southern part of the Central Valley were destined for consumption in Mexico City. The alcaldes mayores, or the local level Spanish officials, made their fortunes by advancing paltry sums of money to Indians as payment for crops still in the field, which the alcaldes then resold after harvest at their true price. They also trafficked in Spanish products needed by Indians, or even in products that Indians did not need but were obligated to buy. One case is known of an Indian who had 12 pairs of new shoes he had been forced to purchase. The introduction of a monetary economy was an objective that colonial authorities pursued diligently. It added another instrument to the ample repertory of exploitation, since mercantile exchange always worked to the benefit of the Spaniards. And in case some doubt should arise to disturb the conscience of the colonizers, there were always people like Lopez de Gomara to pacify their spirits. Quote, "They were given beasts of burden so that they did not have to carry things themselves, wool to wear, and meat to eat, all of which they lacked. They were shown the use of iron and oil lamps to improve their lives. They have been given money so that they may know what to buy and sell, what they owe and what they have. They have been taught Latin and the sciences, which are worth more than whatever gold and silver was taken from them. Because with learning one is truly human, and silver was little used by them and not by everyone. Thus, they were freed by being conquered, and even more so by becoming Christians." This concludes Chapter 5.